thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Asiatopia crew for giving us the opportunity to speak. I don't think there's much danger that I'm going to be entertaining. But please take this as this is a very rough presentation. It's kind of a first draft, so please treat it kindly. Okay, thinking about performance art in Thailand, what's interesting to me is perhaps not how it fits into the field of contemporary art so much as how it doesn't. Now, I've just written a book, actually, about Thai art since 1997. It comes out in a couple of months. And I'm embarrassed to admit here that it says actually very little about performance art. Now, there are reasons for that. Firstly, that the book's not a comprehensive account or summary of this period, but rather it's a set of thematic essays. So the works and the artists that I've chosen follow those themes. Secondly, because it's mainly about Thai art's convergence with a global contemporary art circuit. And while performance art was prominent in the, you might say, the earlier internationalization of the 1990s, performance art hasn't been prominent in the global exchange since, even though it has elsewhere been enshrined in modern art's ever-widening canon. Now, many of us here are celebrating Asiatopia's near 20-year survival, a feat for any independent artist-run group, though it enjoys more institutional support, as we can see, now than it used to. Yet, while I'm very grateful to Chumpon and Ray and the other organisers for this chance to reflect on performance art in Thailand and Southeast Asia, the challenge that suggests itself is not to explain what it's achieved, but rather what it hasn't. 10 years ago, a Thai curator who had studied, for those of you who don't know me, I used to live here. 10 years ago, a Thai curator who had studied in the West told me unself-consciously that he had nothing whatsoever to do with performance and wanted nothing to do with it. I thought it weird at the time, and for some time afterwards, that one could so unapologetically dismiss an art form that was part and parcel of a field of contemporary art that we otherwise unproblematically shared. It was awkward. I didn't know what to say. Such formal discrimination is perhaps not so rare, though the reasons for it are usually clearer. I've met a few curators who had nothing to do with media art, for example, or installation, feeling they had inadequate command over the techniques involved. More common was the reactionary skepticism that something, internet art for example, or perhaps community art, wasn't really art. But we're more accustomed actually to the opposite, a positively defined specialisation. It'd be fine to introduce oneself, as I might, as a curator of Southeast Asian art who focuses on Thailand but doesn't know very much about Myanmar or Brunei. It would be another thing altogether to be a curator of Southeast Asian art who wants nothing to do with Malaysia. The assumption in the first case is that one would at least like to know more about these other places. And perhaps this is why the Thai curator's dismissal of performance was so jarring, for it intimated, without any room for doubt, not only his perfect indifference to the form, but also that this exclusion could be entirely in keeping with one's professional responsibilities as a curator. But I think with hindsight, it probably says as much about my own assumptions as a Farang curator as it says about the Thai curator, about what I'd come to accept as generic templates of international contemporary practice. One can imagine any number of comparable discriminations. Muslim curators might avoid figurative art according to their faith or to conform with official or public taste. A white Australian curator might avoid Indigenous art for fear of being seen to misappropriate it. But if performance art seems a strange thing to exclude, it's because of its kinship with political protest, its liveness, its ephemerality, its unpredictability, its privilege as a difficult thing to commodify or collect, traits that kept it marginal to the market and official art until recently. The image of performance as a neglected form has strengthened its currency among curators working independently of those institutions, though this also is changing as the genre is canonized. Now, my awkward encounter in Bangkok years ago also shows that the reception of an art form can be very specific to a place or a culture. It became less weird as I learned more about what, with his dismissal of performance art, a Thai curator might have had in mind. I now know performance art, as identified, say, in the West, barely appeared in Thailand until the mid-1980s. And when it did, it expressed, with an often literal symbolism, the political angst and aspirations of an urban middle class, that it had some association with the student activism of the 70s, and that 2 decades on, it seemed still preoccupied with the political investments of that period. I discovered that performance entered the toolkit of some Thai artists training abroad and was practiced here in concert with other forms, like video and installation, more than as a standalone genre with its own exclusive formal parameters. I've seen how performance art, the capital P, capital A here, a non-traditional yet ritualistic modern art form, was then established and maintained in Thailand, seemingly content to be excluded from mainstream and institutional art contexts, again, until quite recently. I also know that a neglect of performance and ignorance of its histories has long been an institutional norm in Thai art schools, though that too may change. I'm also more conscious of the ambient Buddhist distrust and denial of bodily experience in favour of mental and spiritual experience, of the dogged suppression of ritual by the Theravadan orthodoxy since the 4th reign, and of the persistence and revival of other ritual practices outside of the art sphere during and since the Cold War. Apinan Kosianon was already suggesting in 1994 that shamanistic traditions, for example, would be key to understanding Southeast Asian performance art. We can only guess which of those factors lay behind the Thai curator's aversion to performance. Yet we can say this: it was perfectly acceptable here in the 21st century for a professional curator of contemporary art to reject performance completely. That is, performance was not, for him, a key ingredient of the contemporary, nor a compelling sign of art's relevance or of artistic leadership. Now, this is weird because, from another point of view, performance was an absolutely pivotal currency of the contemporary, not just of the idiom established in and around Asiatopia in the late 90s, and on associated platforms of an emerging international circuit, such as these, or perhaps Cities on the Move, Bangkok, 1999, or earlier ones indeed, like ARX, which was a platform run out of Western Australia from the late 80s, or Chiang Mai Social Installation from the early 90s. Singapore's Artists' Village was formed in the late 80s around the artist Tang Da Wu, fated for his performances. Though there was no performance art in their inaugural exhibition in 1989, it had become the group's trademark by the time they started to internationalise their efforts, as in the pivotal The Space show at the old Hong Bi warehouse in 92. If anyone's curious about a Thai connection here, Chumpon, as well as Surapon Panya Wachira, were in that show, both having participated in a recurring showcase at the National Museum Art Gallery earlier the same year. Now there, in Singapore, the government's de facto ban on the form, sparked by Joseph Ng's notorious performance 18 months later, while it made life difficult for performance artists, certainly didn't diminish the genre's importance. If anything, it bolstered it. This ban has been historicised as a pivotal, perhaps the pivotal, event in Singapore's contemporary art history. And it produced, among other things, a working definition of performance art. A live, unscripted form, almost innately resistant to official, institutional regulation. A definition that included non-activist positions and excluded other kinds of performance. Artists objected to this arbitrary pigeonhole and worked around it, but this created a kind of target zone to be dodged and then reoccupied when the ban was lifted 10 years later. And it has arguably narrowed art historical views of that period, privileging the narrative of state censorship, for example, over other narratives. Thai governments have been less interested in performance art, less effective in administering it, and frankly, much less creative in defining bad artistic performance than in defining bad political performance. Yet for art historians, the preponderance of a platform like Asiatopia might run a similar risk. While we cheer the consolidation of a network for performance art practitioners, we should also scrutinise the terms of inclusion and exclusion. Indeed, if we think instead about performance as just one amongst many mixed media techniques, rather than as a distinct genre, performance art, capital P, capital A, we find performance was an important component of many other kinds of art, perhaps most of the art called contemporary. Perhaps as far back, I'm going to sort of revert to the Thai context here, perhaps as far back as Chalud Nimsamer's flirtation with wearable art in the context of environmental installation and sculpture in the early 80s. And let's not forget that a kind of performance was integral to the mystique and brand of the modernists, especially those who flourished outside the Silopakorn silo. Silopakorn is the National Art Academy here in Thailand. Especially those who flourished outside of Silopakorn before performance became a currency of a global contemporary. And it wasn't just abstract action painters. Take the charismatic artist guru and TV personality Chalongchai Kositapat, for example, who was nothing if not performative. Here he is firing in the bottom left some kind of karmic fireball at a contestant in a reality game show that he was part of. Now later on, performance would be a crucial ingredient of the artwork itself in installation and other emerging media forms, as in the work of Kamon Pausawat, the Tsuti Kunawichianon. In performance for video, these are fairly randomly selected images. Michael Shawanasai and Manit Sriwanitpum brought a performative dimension, of course, to their photographic works, and in so-called relational art, with its participatory and its delegated performances. Now, I don't want to rain on the parade of performance art as a discrete form here, but I think it's important to look back to this period before it was established as such, when performance and visual art were less clearly demarcated, less defined, and between them lay a space of possibility and connection to other artistic traditions. In this wider spectrum of performative idioms, sometimes the performance is the artwork, sometimes not. Sometimes it's live, sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's an audience, sometimes there's not. Sometimes it's body-centric, sometimes it's not. Performance art itself may, of course, harbour a similar ambivalence in these regards. But these other positions have not been historicised as performance art. That space has been more or less sewn up by the Asiatopian network. Yet The diversity here complicates any notion of performance being inherently political or oppositional, much less innately progressive, and its supposed bond to public space. Art history has not been even-handed. Not all of these idioms have enjoyed the same success within the professional game of art. Some have remained in their niche, local or regional, and developed ingrained habits. And even if they're now gradually absorbed by institutions or art school curricula, they remain isolated in Thai art's historiography. Others, meanwhile, have been catapulted into global circulation and a global marketplace, have become darlings of the Biennale circuit, the toast of its curatorial mafia, and had solo shows in major Western institutions. So here's our challenge. Can we speak of performance as a coherent currency of contemporary art? Why have some performative practices led to generational and geographical holding patterns, while others have conquered the global art world? Why were some destined for regional circuits and others for that global stage? What distinguishes them? And can the difference really be put down to performance art's resistance to the market or its political calling? Later on, I'll suggest some reasons for this divergence that I've described, again quite specific to the Thai context. But the milieu that I've described here was regional, and I've been asked to speak to this wider geography today. A coherent, sustained, transnational network of artists called contemporary started to emerge in the early 1990s in Southeast Asia. Two preconditions were crucial to this. The first was internal. Urban middle classes gained increasing purchase on a public sphere, with the loosening of authoritarian constraints established under Cold War militarist regimes, allowing for the globalization and corporatization of the media. Secondly, an external factor was a growing awareness in the West of contemporary art happening elsewhere. This is often pegged these days to 1989, and indeed these two exhibitions, the Third Havana Biennial and Magicien de la Terre, as well as perhaps Rashid Arain's show The Other Story at the Hayward also in 1989, may as well serve as useful kind of signposts. If the large-scale international exhibition derived from the First World's colonial spectacles of the 19th century, its horizons greatly expanded at the end of the 20th. The rest of the world eagerly furnished new participants and new sites of exhibition. Just 7 years on from 1989, Apinan's Traditions Tensions in New York proved that such shows could and should be conceptualized and mounted by Asians themselves. Meanwhile, a regional network was already preparing artists for that new global stage. Chumpon and his peers deserve recognition for their role in engineering a distinctively Southeast Asian contemporary art. This was already evident 11 years ago. A regional frame seemed necessary to a young Thai critic writing her catalogue essay for Asiatopia 7 in 2005, at which incidentally, 8 out of 10 ASEAN nations were represented. Only Laos and Brunei were missing. What unified the region, she suggested, was a propensity for cultural adaptation, which she calls localization, a very old process often called vernacularization in the study of Southeast Asia. Historicizing Thai performance art, she cited both the Marxist writer Jit Pumisak and his mantra of Silapa Pur Chiwit, Silapa Pur Prachachon, which could be translated as art for life, art for the people, as well as the activism of the 70s that had revived this mantra. The present generation, her present, had had to overthrow another military regime in '92 after all. We can easily imagine why she sought this link from the 50s through the 70s to her present, though one wonders today how she would see this lineage. Her name, by the way, was Tanawi. Now, similarly, in a recent essay on Chiang Mai social installation for the journal After All, Simon Soon connects that 90s platform in Chiang Mai with artistic protest of the 70s, a history of art's domestication of the street as democratic public space. He's right to identify a kinship between these moments, and we'll actually be taking these questions further in a symposium to be held in Melbourne in Australia next month. But I have to say I have reservations as well about this genealogy, both of these genealogies. Firstly, for the events of '76 in particular had a profound chilling effect on both protest and public art as a protest medium, especially since an act of political theatre, the alleged burning of a certain effigy, photographs of which are said to have been doctored, was used to provoke and to justify the most savage atrocities committed by the paramilitary gangs. We'd also have to examine the very different social and geopolitical climates of these moments. In the 70s, context of economic crisis, of course, war, and the peak of Cold War paranoia, versus the 90s, with Thailand's Cold War effectively having been over since the amnesty of 1982, a burgeoning middle class then reaching for the blue skies of prodigious economic growth. Now, one awkward result of this reversal of Thailand's fortunes was that progressives of the 70s had swung largely into line with the retro-feudalism that won the 90s. As pivotal figures, I could mention for the Thai listeners, Sulak, Chamlong Tumuang, and the leftist come village nationalist Chatit Natsupha, started to move decentralizations of state power, fueling a localism that more and more converged with the ideological ground claimed by the palace. This accelerated particularly after '97. And on this subject, by the way, I would recommend the writings of Tongchai Winichakul. It's written specifically about the village economy. So we would want to look at the early 90s, I think, very, very carefully indeed, before claiming any progressive political or aesthetic continuity between the 70s and the present. Belonging to such a genealogy might consist in one's claim to the street and one's acceptance that it belongs equally to one's opponents. But it would not consist in any transcendent moral purpose or universal democratic principle, nor in any heroic notion of artistic struggle. This poses problems for a regional history too. Performance and the body have had charged valence in Southeast Asia's emerging and restive public spheres. But before democracy, civil society, or protest art take their places in a regional art history, their local historical contingencies need to be analysed. Desire for a democratic civil society was widely felt and informed politically engaged and formally adventurous art. Art did partake of an emergent public agency that claimed the street as its theatre. And those social movements did draw on art in precipitating political change, in resistance to Suharto's New Order, in rejection of the Marcos dictatorship. But the valence of political art in general and of performance in particular was conditioned in each case by local norms. The dangers of lumping one progressivism in with another can be acute, as we saw with the recent debacle over Suti's exhibition in Guangzhou. Protests can share an aesthetic without sharing much else. These righteous chaps you see here are campaigning to prevent the state from recognising the existence of a Muslim community that's been in Myanmar since the 15th century. It's about 1.3 million of them today. Now, I'll expand on this point with two very quick examples. In the Philippines in the mid-70s, street and town square were contested on the one hand by social realist groups like the Kaiserhan from 1976, and at the same time by the state vanguardism of the Marcos's Cultural Center of the Philippines. For example, Jose Merced's 1974 electro-ethnomusicological seance, Ugnayan. Both camps, that is, both the CCP, the Cultural Center of the Philippines camp, and the Kaiserhan and other similar activist art groups, had very strong nationalist inclinations. Kaiserhan artist Jose Tensu Ruiz recalls the reciprocal nourishments, this is his phrase, reciprocal nourishments passing between progressive civil society and progressively minded artists at the time. But for all the Marcos regime's crimes, and there were many, there was plenty of progressive activity at the CCP too, where state developmentalism fostered its developmental art. And this was about as close to a mainstream of organised modern art as conceptualism came in Southeast Asia, then or since. In the 1980s, Mulyono's community-embedded consciousness-raising practice in East Java grew from his frustrations with the depoliticised modernism thriving under Suharto, and his frustration with both the social realism of an older left nationalism, which he said reified the Orang Kecil, or the little people, as protagonists in a national drama, but didn't even bother to speak to them, and his frustrations with the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, or Indonesian New Art Movement, which rejected the pompous nationalist discourse in favour of the popular, yet did nothing, in Mulyono's view, to elevate local or folk cultures as vehicles of artistic or political renovation. Now, formally speaking, Mulyono's and Maceda's experiments, both aesthetically progressive, both attempts to activate non-art publics through art, outside art institutions, both innovative and socially engaged forms with live and performative dimensions, inclusive and participatory, both with foreign vanguard inspirations. But despite the similar contexts, authoritarianism, of anti-imperialism, one was a vehicle of the centralising authoritarian state, the other a strident, ground-up decentralisation. So bringing these together, I think, shows us two things. One, late modernist moves towards the street and the village were not necessarily looking for the same kinds of progress. Two, the common political currency here was not the activation of public space, nor civil society's rejection of authoritarian repression, but localism. This, I'm arguing, would need to be distinguished from discourses of national struggle or nation building from the decolonisation period. So they're complications of a national narrative, more than simply being bids for inclusion or representation within it. Now, so far, historicisation of the 70s, art historicisation of the 70s, for example, Ahmad Mashhadi's, tends to focus on the tensions and contradictions between internationalism and nationalism, often translated into an iconographic struggle between abstraction and realism. But the pivotal groups that even Mashhadi identifies, the artists of the Towards a Mystical Reality show in Malaysia, the Indonesian New Art Movement, Kaiserhan, expressed frustrations at the time with precisely that binary and ranged deliberately across both of those idioms and put their solutions in explicitly localist terms. To historicise performance in art, or performance art, regionally, I would suggest that this localism forms the primary ideological backdrop, more than struggles within or in the name of nation, and more than any putative internationalism. The extra-national dimensions of an emergent regional contemporary art weren't international in a normal sense, but were translocal. The main variables, it seems, were how quickly and enthusiastically they were to take up the local and the traditional, and secondly, the readiness of the state in each distinct place to compete in that valorization of the local. So, returning to Chumphon's statement made 2 decades earlier, of the first part, sorry, 2 decades later than that 70s moment, of the first part of his, the phrases that I've highlighted here at the bottom, of the first part, yes, this yearning was regional. But the second part probably wasn't, was not regionalist. What community was at stake here? One can read this taking control in various ways. It could refer to a national polity, especially at this time of acute national instability, a few months after the financial crisis broke. Artists want to promote dialogue and question social norms, he says. But the public was bemused and indifferent to their provocations. This indeed was the refrain of the article in the Wall Street Journal, including even the micro-public gathered at Concrete House. And since '97, of course, those of you who know Thailand's predicament will understand that the people's shaky grip on that national polity has become rather weaker. Popular sovereignty having all but surrendered to another kind. Or it could point to a more modest level of local political community. Now, up to this point, I'm back in Asiatopia, Volume 7. One could still have characterised the subculture, or indeed the late 90s, one could still have characterised that subculture with some political agenda or aspirations as a kind of vanguard. But since then, another kind of contemporary art has assumed that mantle, a more convincing kind of leadership and another kind of performance. And the two rarely have appeared alongside one another, nor engaged in much meaningful correspondence. In the book, I sketch a kind of local history of leadership, an agency characterised not by visible action, but by withdrawal, that connects modern art to a much older sociology and geography of power. This suggests that good old individualist performance art, almost by definition, would be disqualified from vanguard status, precisely because it demands that an artist not withdraw. In Thailand, what constitutes advanced artistic position is not individual expression, but sociality and collaboration. Not forthright political critiques, but ambivalence and compromise. Not authentic bodily presence, but withdrawal and delegation. Indeed, the avant-garde archetype, iconoclastic, manifesto-toting revolutionary, was never a norm of Thai modern art, which was born institutional, the love child of a chauvinist state, and Italian neoclassical academicism. Artistic leadership has rarely been attributed to political stances, more often to stylistic agility, and most often to moral posturing. It bears remembering that before the establishment of modern art training in the 1930s, the artist's status was lowly, that of a nameless craftsman. By the 50s, though, this figure had begun to accrue the capacity for authorship and intellectual authority, thanks to the foreign credentials and pragmatism of its Italian founder. In just a few generations, the artist gained access to both the fonts of symbolic patronage, traditionalist royalist on one hand and secular nationalist on the other, which define together the Thai social pyramid. And if the artist climbed that pyramid, it was not by being the most technically adept or industrious, not by being the most original or forthright individual, but rather by being one who might cause things to be done. Individualism receded even further with the waning of Silapakorn's monopoly in the 1990s. Yet the success of the so-called relational artists as global art brands since then suggests to me that it was reinscribed somehow within the person of the artist as a kind of aura, the secret ingredient that I'm characterizing in the book with the Thai word barami. Typically translated as charisma, this term denotes renown rather than fame. It's associated with kingship, implying beneficent majesty, but it doesn't simply come along with royal title. In the ideal of Hindu-Buddhist kinship, or Dhammaraja, barami attests to an accumulation of merit in one's past lives. And while the everyday English connotations of charisma are secular and class neutral, implying a certain social ease or popularity, barami does not connote any lateral social chemistry, or what Nicolas Bouillot would have called conviviality, but rather belongs to a vertical system of social relations that is unmistakably hierarchical and conservative. It has recently taken on an added sinister ambivalence describing...
1 minute, yeah.
1 minute. Describing political puppet masters, instrumental but unseen, often unnamed charismatic individuals, those accomplished in the arts of persuasion and coercion. Not those who do, but those who cause things to be done. In other words, those whose efficacy in the world, put down to past deeds, is discernible without visible action on their own part. And it's precisely this kind of power that I argue has qualified certain Thai artists so very well for success under the relational banner. Okay, so I'm going to have to wrap up here. The modern artist's barami, I'm suggesting, hinges upon retirement or withdrawal from the political sphere and from institutional power. This is a process that has very deep roots, of course, in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of literature on withdrawal, both in political history and geography and in sociology and in anthropology. And in the book I'm identifying the monks of the wandering forest tradition as a kind of archetype. So to conclude, I think this older geography illuminates somewhat the intellectual engagements and demurrals of modern artists. This, I would suggest, could help us to begin to explain this gulf between performance art and the other kinds of performance that I enumerated earlier. Performance art being a haven for positive individualism, whereas with their delegated performances and their compromises, the others sidestepped the national minefield on their way to global stardom. Their negative individualism worked well for them. But if one day the relational artists are remembered, it won't be for leadership. Thanks.